You may have felt or been prompted to speak to someone. And I'm hoping that today you'll get a sense of how to do that better, how to do it, to be courageous enough, and so on. So I'm going to turn it over to the videos like we've been doing these last several weeks, and I'm going to invite you to pay attention to the screen.
Hello, welcome back to this gospel witness journey. Do you have a favorite family recipe that's been passed down from generation to generation? In our family, my kids are always asking me for my recipe for white chicken chili. But my truthful answer is always, I don't know, I kind of throw in a little bit of whatever I have on hand. I don't know how much Monterey Jack cheese or how much salsa I put in the chili that particular time. It just kind of depends. That can be really frustrating for them as they're learning to cook. But if they just know the basic ingredients, they can play around with it, and their own versions will be just as good. For the same reasons, learning to be a gospel witness or learning the process of evangelism can be just as frustrating. So often we want a recipe, we want exact ingredients so that the result is the same every single time. Unfortunately, gospel witness is not like that, because our context, the people we're sharing the good news with, changes every time. The context for sharing the gospel, the good news today, is different than it ever has been in the past. Today, many of our neighbors don't know who Jesus is or don't know very much about what the church is for. Some of us learned a recipe for evangelism that no longer works because our neighbors don't know very much about the gospel. Today, I'm going to share a recipe with you about how to share the good news with your neighbors. Again, this is a recipe that doesn't have exact ingredients, and it's not going to produce the same exact result every time. But if you know the general ingredients and can play with them a little bit and adapt them to your own context, you will have some confidence in how to share this good news with your neighbor. The first ingredient is knowing your neighbor and knowing your neighbor's life, knowing what's happening in their life, knowing their fears, their joys, their worries, their anxieties, the things that they celebrate. This happens over a long period of time, being present with your neighbor and getting to know them with some intentionality. The second ingredient is knowing about who God is. What do we know about God's character? What do we know about who God is? What do we know about what God wants for us and for His creation? What do we know about the work that God is doing in our neighborhoods, in our communities, working with the Spirit to redeem and restore all things? And then, what does it look like when we put those two ingredients together? Where do we see who God is present in our neighbor's life? Where do we see what God is doing as what God is doing in our neighbor's life? And finally, when prayerfully is there an opportunity to share that good news with them, to name for them, to reveal to them where God is at work in their life? We're going to hear a story now from Ari, who's telling us about what it looks like to proclaim the good news with a neighbor of his.
I've lived here for many years in this neighborhood, and always knew a number of my neighbors. But then, when I became part of a small group at church, we started to look at how we could be more intentional about being good neighbors, and that was for me a big eye opener. I never considered the notion of being intentional. And it started out with just going for walks and noticing who was out and who was not out, who was doing what, and basically making sure I greeted everyone and stopped and made short talk. So being intentional forced me to remember more of the conversations that I had with people. And then the conversation became much more than just a hi, hello, how are you, or oh, fine, goodbye. So I got to know, over a number of months, I got to know a lot of a lot of folks in this area, and I got to know a lot about them because I remembered it. I was interested. I became much more interested in people and share myself as well. As I was doing that, it became sort of more automatic that relationships started to develop, and we started to talk about things that became a little bit more meaningful over time. And so there are 100 stories that there are. I know there's a couple at the end of this alleyway, and a couple of years ago they lost their son to suicide, and they were devastated, terribly devastated, and became very, very angry with God for not preventing that. And I remember we started visiting them, just bring a bowl of soup or whatever and just listen to them. And I think for myself at least, I bring Jesus more directly through those kinds of things, those kind of interactions with people, listening and allowing people to express themselves. And then there's opportunity to do pray, either for people before you even get there, or there are times when it comes up during the conversation. It comes up more naturally if you have a relationship that has been growing for a number of months or years. So 3 weeks ago, I walked through the alley. I was going to go down there. We were sitting outside, both of them. They come, go here, we want to talk to you. So sit down. And their grandson had just committed suicide. It was the son of their son who had committed suicide at 56. And now this guy's son had just committed suicide at 26. And they were just sitting outside. They had just heard the news. And they were just devastated. And again, it was just, they saw me coming by, and it was not because I'm so good. I just happened to walk by and wanted to offload. And again, there was this fierce anger to God, and so on and so forth. And really, all you can do in those those moments is just listening to them and just let them blow off steam. Allow God to take that, and things slow down a little bit, and then I could share a little bit better about sort of challenging them maybe in some hopefully gentle way, and saying, what if God was crying with you? What if God was sad for you? What if he didn't want to see this happen as well? And then the conversation can begin opening up. They can either agree with it or disagree, and then I'm not out there to make any points or to have an argument with anyone, but there are these natural ways in which conversations can open up and become a little deeper. And you just have to be willing to, I think, first of all, listen and then discern where the Spirit is going with this. And then just be yourself. There's opportunities every day that I've began to see as what I call God moments. They're not orchestrated by myself. They're just because I've learned to open my ears and my eyes. And this is something that God just wants us to do, that God calls us to. That this is a normal thing. This is not heroics. This is not special church missions. This is what God calls each and every one of us to.
Evangelism, proclaiming gospel witness, is something that takes both deeds and words. It's something that takes place over a long period of time as we develop relationships with our neighbors and the people around us. How are you going to share the good news in your neighborhood with your neighbors? What is the recipe you'll develop? Where do you see God's story intersecting their story?
I recently received some bad news about a friend of mine. Her name is Riley. Last summer, we met her during her battle with addiction. She and her friend Cody met with me several times, and we had long discussions about faith and hope and recovery. And of course, during those months, we had lots of opportunities to watch her struggle. She's 27. She has 2 kids. Her mother's watching her kids. She works the street. She works the system. Janet and I took her last summer to the refuge. We introduced her to a caseworker. We got her connected for housing, for finding ways to help her with her finances, to give her opportunities for addictions counseling. We did everything that we thought that we could at the time, but she had to take the initiative. She had to accept the help that we gave her. She'd been staying with her grandmother in Newcastle. She'd been staying in shelters. She'd been sleeping in hotel rooms, sleeping with different people, sleeping on the couch, sleeping on the floor. And Friday morning, we got the news that she overdosed. She was 27. I connected with her grandmother on Friday, and she actually told me, after I expressed my condolences to her, that Riley had actually gotten an apartment and that she was ready to move in this past weekend. And I kept going over and over in my mind whether or not I had done enough. Elaine and I connected Friday. Janet and I talked about it on Thursday, or on Friday as well. And the two of us, because she was connected with Cody, who also passed away earlier this year, it just opened up all of those wounds in us for losing both Cody to addiction and Riley. And for us, one of the things that we kept saying to one another, especially Elaine and I on the phone, was there something else that we could have done? Now, I know that Cody and Riley are responsible for their behavior. But at the time when I was meeting with Riley, we met with Cody and Riley. I met with them every week for 2 months, and then I met with them regularly after that. And during that time, we got her connected with some help. We tried to get Cody connected with some help. And my primary concern was getting her help for her addiction. But on Friday, my main concern was whether or not I told her enough about Jesus. You're probably not going to be confronted with scenarios like this in your life. Maybe it's because of the nature of the work that I do or the people that I connect with that I'm seeing it up front and up close. But I think that every single one of us will get to a point sometime when we ask ourselves, when that person is gone, did I talk about my faith at all? Enough. They're responsible for their choices, but was I the person? I can only ask God for forgiveness if that's the case in my life. And to make a commitment to do and to try to be as faithful as possible. Jesus is my example. He's the one that I look to because he looks at me and says, Martin, there's nothing that you can do that's not forgivable, first of all. But secondly, that's going to make me love you any less. And so today, I want you to hear about what Jesus did with the Samaritan woman. Because when we witness, as just like Amy said, she's a good friend of mine who was on this video, relationships take time. They take ongoing conversation and connection. And not every conversation are you going to be preaching the gospel in someone's face, right? That's not how you have good, solid relationships. You get the opportunities as they come along to speak truth, to ask questions, to be there regardless. From John chapter 4, the story of the Samaritan woman. Let's read that together. Jesus knew the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing and making more disciples than John, although Jesus himself didn't baptize them as his disciples did. So he left Judea and returned to Galilee. He had to go through Samaria on the way. Eventually, he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon, a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please, give me a drink." He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. Jesus has what it seems to me to be a random encounter with someone on the side of the road. But unless you understand the shock value of what the original audience would have read into this, I need to share that with you, the context, so that when you hear it maybe more so from their perspective. First of all, this woman is coming at noon, and Jesus is there at noon, and he's by himself. He sent his disciples off, and this woman comes to be here at noon. And the first thing that Jesus would have noticed is that she's by herself. Women never go to the well by themselves. It's always a social time. It's always a gathering where women can connect and talk and go in the cool of the day during the morning to get water. And here she is by herself. That says something either about her or about her community or both. The second thing you need to know is that Jesus crossed gender barriers and he crossed cultural barriers in order to speak with her. You know, people are very fond of making fun of the church and claiming that we have a patriarchal system based upon a model of patriarchy and that we're all misogynists and that men are power hungry and the church just gives them their power that they need. Well, there may be people who have taken power, and I would say absolutely and without reservation that they are sinning. But Jesus here stepped over the racial, cultural, and gender barrier to speak to her. Orthodox Jews today are still not allowed to be in the same room with a woman of the opposite sex he's not married to by himself. Sorry, a woman. Orthodox Jews are not allowed to be with a woman in the same room with them who's not their spouse or a child. It was no different for Jewish men in Jesus' days. As a matter of fact, it was even worse. Women were, at best, considered property, at worst, treated as slaves. And Jesus spoke to her. She was a Samaritan. Samaritans were half-breeds. They were people that were despised by the Jews. They were people that were avoided by the Jews. People would walk around the municipality where they lived so they wouldn't have to get themselves dirty by hanging around with Samaritans. And so the woman's connection with Jesus must have really overwhelmed her because she comes at noon. She has this man who's willing to speak to her. And not only is he a man, but he's a Jew, and she's a Samaritan. I think in very short order, Jesus communicated to her that he was a friend. I get that sense, that she felt comfortable to talk to him. Being a friend is one of the first things that I want you to pay attention to when it means to prepare. Amy said it very clearly here on the video, is that first and foremost, we need to be friends. And friendship, regardless of the fact whether someone comes to church with you or not, friendship means that we have the opportunity to pray for and to care for and to live next to people who don't know Jesus. Jesus hung around with prostitutes. He hung around with sinners. He hung around with people like tax collectors. As a matter of fact, he got a bad rap from everyone around town who said that he's just hanging around with sinners. He eats with them. And he walked among them. His preference was to be amongst those who were lost, lonely, distressed, perishing, and sick. There's a story by a man named Watchman Nee. Watchman Nee was a Chinese evangelist. He had a family over to his house. He and the husband went into the basement with the son. The two moms were upstairs getting a meal ready. And the young boy downstairs cried out to his mother upstairs to get something for him. And he says, can you get it for me? And his mother, replies and says, come up here and get it. It's up here. And the boy, maybe being a little whiny, maybe being a little small, I don't know, said, can you bring it to me, Mommy, please? And so she did. And Watchman Nee looked at this and said to his friend, that's what Jesus did. Because as a friend, I now have an opportunity to go to someone like that mother did for that child. You see, when my friend's hurting, when my friend is in pain, when they need, they often don't reach out. They don't go to. They don't find it themselves. And if we're not careful, what we tend to do in the church is we tend to say, well, they can come if they want to. They can find out if they want to. They know where to look. They can call me. They can ask me. And what we communicate is that they need to get their act together. I was going to say a different word, but that's not polite. That they need to get their act together before they can come to Jesus. Sometimes I think that what we tend to do is we tend to wait for them to come to us rather than for us to go to them. That's not what our Savior did for us. He went to them. Second thing that I think Jesus did here that's so profound. First, he became friendly to her. Obviously, he didn't have a long-term friendship, but he communicated so much in such a short amount of time that she felt like she could talk to him. The second thing that he did was ask questions. You know, it's never a bad move to ask questions from people. If you want to get closer to the heart of what's going on in someone's life, ask questions. Just take the time to ask questions. With the Samaritan woman, Jesus asked her for a drink. He actually asked her for help. Just think about that for a minute. She's on guard. Here's this man, this Jewish man, who could lay into her for being a Samaritan, who could lay into her for being a woman, who could send her away and wait until he was done. All probably would have happened before. And in that moment, he asks her for help. And he asks questions. Verse 7, Johan, please put that up. Soon, a Samaritan woman came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, please give me a drink. He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. And she said to Jesus, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? So this question, this request that Jesus gives to her, elicits a response. It elicits a question in return, right? She's now curious. All right, I'm taken a bit back by this situation. Now you want my help. I just need to clarify. You're a Jew, right? Yeah. And I'm a woman. You get that, right? Yeah, I get that. And you're asking me for help? Okay. All right. Now, what happens when Jesus does that is he creates some kind of curiosity with this woman. What in the world is this guy about? And he asks questions. But secondly, she becomes interested. Okay, he's obviously different than what I expected. And he's not trying to make me feel less than. He's not trying to put me down. He's not trying to get rid of me. One of the things that I find is so important when I share my faith with someone is that I always give people an out for not having or requiring them to believe what I'm saying. When I conduct a funeral or I do a wedding or I do a public speaking of some sort where I know that there's a lot of people in the room that don't know Jesus, I just say it plainly. I say, you don't have to believe what I believe. You don't have to participate in what I'm participating in. You don't have to pray if you don't want to pray. But if you would be honoring to us who are going to pray, who are going to share, we would appreciate you even more. Something along that lines. And as soon as I do that, it all of a sudden puts people off their I'm defensive to, okay, this guy is giving me permission to not believe a word that he says. So I'll just sit here and listen. And then Jesus gives her something. So he becomes friendly, he asks questions, and then he gives her something. When you're talking to your friends and your neighbors, people who are in need of something, this man's testimony was that this family was in desperate need for someone to listen to their story about the suicide of their son and now grandson. Someone needed to listen to the story. And Jesus gives the woman something that she needs. She's coming in the middle of the day. We don't know the story yet. We are going to hear it in just a moment. But he says, you obviously came here for water. Let me give you living water. Listen to what Jesus says. Verse 9. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. She said to Jesus, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? Jesus replied, if you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me and I would give you living water. There's a play on words here in the original language. Living water means running water or fresh water. And Jesus is saying living water like it's going to give you eternal life, that kind of living water. And so she would go to a well where the water was stagnant. They would much prefer to go to a river or a stream where the water was fresh, living water. Jesus is giving her an opportunity to give her something that she needs. But sir, I don't have a rope or bucket, she said, and this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think that you're greater than our ancestor Jacob who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed? And Jesus replied, anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again, but those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Please, sir, give me this water, and then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water. Jesus gives her something that she needs. If I knew a scientist who was struggling with the origins of the universe and was wondering about whether or not God existed or not, I wouldn't go to him and tell him how addicts get recovery through faith in Jesus Christ. That would not be, it might be an anecdote, something that they might not be interested in. He might not be interested in. He might be more interested if I helped him to understand how God could be the creator of the universe, how a scientific exploration of his faith would be much more significant to him than talking about somebody's recovery. What's the need? What's the thing that we need to say for that person because they are in need? At this point, Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman and talking about water. It's exactly what she needed. We have to also be careful that we don't limit our witness to pointing out people's problems. Could you imagine if we just did that, right? You need Jesus because. You need Jesus because. How well does that go over? Not very well at all. We do need to do that at some point because Jesus did that here in the story. But we have to do it with love and grace and compassion and say the relationship that you want with Jesus is going to bring you hope. It's going to bring you healing. It's going to bring you comfort and peace in your life. That's what you're looking for in a relationship with Jesus. This is how Jesus handled it. This is like pretty blunt, right? So Jesus says this in verse 14 or verse 16. Go get your husband. Wait a minute, that's like a major shift in the conversation. I want to give you living water. She says, give it to me, Lord. I will have that living water. And then he says, go get your husband. I don't have a husband, the woman replied. Jesus said, you're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man that you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth. Ouch. That's why she's not coming during the day, during the morning. That's why she's coming at noon. Socially, she's an outcast. If you were to describe this woman, many people have said that she's probably a prostitute. If not, certainly someone who cannot get the marriage thing down. And she keeps going and looking for something from each of these people that she's with. And there's something that's missing. Something deep in here. Jesus said, you're right. Verse 19. Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is only one place to worship, while Samaritans claim it's here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshiped? Smokescreen time, right? I don't want to talk about the fact that I've had 5 husbands, and now the guy that I'm with is my husband. I don't want to talk about that, Jesus, so I'm going to change the subject, and I'm going to put you on the defense, because some of you worship over there, some of you, we worship over here. What's the big deal, right? Let's answer that question rather than go deeper into what's going on in my life. And so Jesus answers. He says, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him. For salvation comes through the Jews. But the time is coming, and indeed it's here now, when their worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father's looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And then the last thing Jesus does is he points her to the gospel message. He becomes a friend. He asks questions. He gives something that she needs. And then he talks about the good news, the message of the gospel. And he points her to the Messiah himself. And then the woman says, I know that the Messiah is coming, the one who is called the Christ. And when he comes, he will explain everything to us. And then Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. Every person who asks questions about Christianity or who is interested in becoming a Christian must answer the question, who is Jesus? From whatever background they come from whatever journey that they go through. It all ends at the foot of the cross about who is Jesus. Now, we must be careful that we don't wag our fingers and point out all those sins. There's time for Jesus to fix what's broken later. There's time for the Holy Spirit to work in people's life later. Now, it's about sharing what we know. See, the interesting part of this story is that the Samaritan woman is so overcome by what Jesus had to say that she goes back into her town. She goes back to the people that she knows, and she says to them, look, this man, he knew everything about me. And she told them what he told her. And they get so curious by her testimony, she is now a witness of what God has been doing in her life, that all she did was tell them what happened. And she says, you must come see who this man is. She knew these people because they were her friends, or at least some of them probably were. Most of them were probably antagonistic towards her. What does she do next? She asks questions. She gets up to them. She starts telling the story. She asks questions to them. Don't you want to come see? She then gives something to them that they need. A message of hope. And they come, and she gets them to stay, or gets Jesus to stay with them for 2 days as he explains who he is and why he has come. In this series, we've been talking about being prepared, being present. Last time we talked about being present, being prepared to know that Jesus is who he says he is, that he is who he is for me in my life, and that I have received that. And now that I have received it, I am going to be a witness to the world about it. But I need to be prepared. I need to know people. I need to have conversations with my neighbors, to be present with people. Just like they said here in the message here. And it takes a long time. And it takes multiple conversations. And most of the time, it's just about being a friend. But sometimes there's going to be questions about faith. Riley asked me one of those questions. She said, I know you talk a lot about Jesus, and I don't know if I believe that or not. And what she did at that moment is gave me an opening every time we got together again to talk about Jesus. Unknowingly, she opened the door for me to come in and say, hey, how's it going about this Jesus thing that you've been wrestling with? And then I got to point out for her how God has been at work in her life. We sat at the table at a Pizza on downtown Oshawa, and she was suffering with a toothache. I remember her sitting right across the seat from me, and she's complaining that her face hurt so badly, and she kept holding her cheek. And I said to her, well, can I pray for you, that God would heal you? And she said, sure, very reluctantly. And so Cody and Riley and myself, we held hands together, and we prayed for her. And then we went our way. The next week I saw her, I said, how's your toothache? She said, it's gone. Now I have an opportunity to say, that was God in your life. That was God giving you a glimpse of what heaven's going to be like. That is God giving you an opportunity to say thank you for what he's done in your life. I don't know if I did enough. I pray that one day we will meet again. But the journey is still something that you and I are called to all the time. Who is your neighbor? I don't know. You know. What I want you to do is I want you to think about who your neighbor is right now. Who is the person that you need to build a friendship with, that you need to ask questions of? Maybe you need to give them something that they need. This man in the video gave meals when someone was grieving and going through their loss. What is it that they need? Is they need a conversation about something. And so right now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Annika if she would get up with the microphone, and you can share with us how we can pray for you. Maybe there's a person that comes to mind. Just say their name, and we will pray for them. Maybe there's a courage that you need to speak to someone. Maybe there is an opportunity that you see ahead that God might do some work in. I know this is kind of, putting you on the spot here. Some of you are feeling kind of, oh boy, I'm not saying nothing. Okay, that's fine. But promise me that you'll make a promise to Jesus about it. That you'll do what you say you will as a result of this message today.